Was hitting the wrong buttons. Hey, YouTube. Welcome to the RPG Daily. I'm Richard Quiner, and we're back with another episode of the Game Master's Craft. I'm here. I have a very special guest who has some... I've really enjoyed her aesthetic on her Instagram page, and the content that she's creating lately has really caught my attention in terms of looking at some of the lore and history of the Forgotten Realms, and as well as just presenting the high-quality products that come out of Dungeons & Dragons, not only from Wizards of the Coast, but also all the other solo creators out there. So, we are going to be talking today with Breanna Flaim from Breanna Flaim on Instagram. I keep hitting the wrong buttons today. All right, Breanna, welcome to the show. Thank you for taking the time today to sit down and have this chat. It's really good having you. Before we dive into me asking and trying to find the difficult, tough questions to ask you, tell us a little about what you do and what your content is like.
Awesome. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk with you today about this. So my content's a little bit different than a lot of what you'll find on social media in the D&D community. So I specialize, if you will, in what I refer to as tabletop role-playing photography. So essentially that's a fancy way of me taking content, props that are used within the D&D community or even other tabletop game systems, and laying it out in an aesthetic way and trying to start conversations and bring attention to maybe topics that aren't being discussed.
Mm-hmm. All right, that's a very succinct answer. Better than I could have explained it. I feel like you've explained that several times before.
Once or twice, yeah.
Okay. I also wanted to just get an idea of what your history with the game and the hobby was and how you got started running your own games.
Well, I started playing technically a little over 5.5 years ago at the tail end of 4th edition. I know I told you this earlier. I don't remember anything about 4th edition, so I can say I played it, but I am not knowledgeable in it whatsoever. I had a old coworker I worked with. We were bonding over different discussions of like geek and nerd culture interests that we shared, and he and his wife invited my partner and I to try D&D. They'd been out of practice, hadn't played in a few years, and really wanted to get back into it. And we would meet up like maybe once a month. It was really infrequent for the first few years. But once we started playing more regularly, we just kind of fell in love with it, and we've been playing ever since.
Nice. With the same group?
Yep. So that group, we actually ended it was about 6 months ago at this point. We ended a 5-year campaign, essentially. Whoa. It was our first characters that we played together. They were the God Killers. Title we had kind of took on after going through the entire Tyranny of Dragons module. So after Tiamat fell, that was our title. Definitely went into some homebrew content after that, and now we are playing in the Ravnica setting, a new campaign.
New campaign, new characters.
Yep. Entirely new setting, completely different characters than what we were playing in our first campaign too. So nice.
That's really interesting because having a game, a campaign kind of run that long is no small feat. Scheduling conflicts always get in the way. Other things, other kind of personal issues could come up. It doesn't happen all that often. What was it like actually finishing a 5-year campaign? How did you feel coming to the end of your story?
It was very bittersweet. That's really the only word I can use to describe it, because there was, honestly, I mean, we expected it to be ending. It wasn't, a surprise at all. We planned, we knew it was coming up, but those characters were still like really close to our hearts. I will forever remember my first character, Alcade, and she like has that special place for me where it's really sad and I miss playing her, but it was a very satisfying end to a really long story.
Okay. So what was just I'm sure you have several favorite moments from 5 years or so of playing. What was one of your favorites? Just a story moment.
Oh, a story moment.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, that's really hard actually. I got uh in game the killing blow on Tiamat, and that was incredibly satisfying. I don't know what it was. It was very interesting. Whenever we came across dragons, I ended up getting the final hit in on them, which was a lot of fun. But that's like the dragon to end all dragons
Hmm.
right there. So that was probably one of my favorite moments.
That's wow. So,
Yeah,
and that wasn't even at the end of the campaign, correct? That was
wasn't.
okay. That's something that you can brag about forever. What did you guys do with your characters afterwards?
After that, so we ended up going into, like I mentioned, heavily homebrew stuff.
Hmm.
So we were still based in Faerun, but we went into some homebrew. Added in a city called the City of Darathay, which I didn't come up with a backstory for my character whatsoever. It was my first character, and I
Hmm.
didn't know what I was doing. So one of the other players, Steph, she's so creative, a writer by trade. So you know, kind of comes with the territory. She
Hmm.
came up with this homebrew city and an amnesia ridden backstory for my character for me, essentially. And it translated really well. It was very easy for me to step into. So we went kind of into that backstory immediately after we finished with the Tyranny of Dragons.
Okay.
And then into some stuff for her character as well and her backstory afterwards. And that was probably the longer period of time.
Okay. So then it became more of a homebrew, just focus on the characters. Um,
Yeah.
so I wanted to, since I know you played in that now, and that's a big accomplishment playing for 5 years in the same campaign. And then I also know you do a lot of streams. Before we dive into it, me asking all these questions about playing the game, what are some of the streams that you've been on recently?
So, I have been a part of four fairly regular streams. So, three of them are on the Fabled 42 network. One is the Origins of Ukador, which is on every Monday. Then also Adventures in Middle Earth, which is the first Sunday of every month, as well as Fables of Ukador, which is, I believe, the second Sunday of every month. So, unfortunately, with my scheduling at work, I'm having to take a step back and I'm on a brief hiatus from Origins and Adventures in Middle Earth, but I'm still
Hmm.
on the Fables as well as Vorpal Board's River Break stream. It's DM'd by
Okay.
Art Wright, who
Arthur,
you have
yeah.
previously interviewed,
Yeah, he
actually.
was
So
my very first uh, guest on the show.
oh, that's awesome. I didn't realize that he was the guinea pig.
Yeah, he was my guinea pig. And then since then, I had more technical problems than I had that first day, but that's fine. That comes with the territory. So getting into that and creating all these characters, because you've had to then create at least one character for each of those um, to add into this story that they're telling. What? Let's just go like surface level. What is one tip you have for new players to create an interesting character?
I would say don't be afraid to pull inspiration. I feel like a lot of people, myself included, have this concern that they need to come up with something entirely original for their first character. And that's
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily the case. If, for instance, I'm a huge Legends of Zelda fan, I have very intentionally tried not to pull too much inspiration from that, but I have. I
Mm-hmm.
think of Zelda in Ocarina of Time and her assisting as with her magical prowess and range capabilities during fights. So I think, okay, I really like utilizing that, and I took a little bit of inspiration for a rogue that I have with that character. So just
Mm-hmm.
something. Don't be afraid to pull inspiration. It's not a bad thing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That also ties into DMing. You've DM'd a bit yourself.
Yeah.
What have you drawn from for inspiration for your games?
Ooh, okay. So a lot of different things actually, and a lot of credit has to go to my DMs that I have. So I between like obviously we just mentioned Art, Chris Solo as well. My partner Nathan is one of my long-term DMs as well as my friend Jake, and then there's Jason. There's a long list of DMs
Mm-hmm.
that I pull a lot of inspiration from because I feel like it's so interesting to see everyone else's styles. As
Mm-hmm.
there's different ways that Nathan will describe things that I wouldn't have thought of saying in terms of like a narrative sense that I really like. So I kind of take a little bit of that and implement it into my own narrative process. And that's across the board.
That's really good. A lot of times we think about inspiration as like movies and books and television, but yeah, the other people, that's a pretty solid place to look for advice. There's a question in the audience. Normally, I would save this for later, but I wanted to tackle this while we were kind of on the subject of players and this early stuff. They were asking for advice for players on character creation and custom backgrounds. Have you done a custom background for any of your characters before?
Custom background, I haven't.
Okay.
I'm perfectly honest about that. So, um, I may not be the best resource mechanically on that, but I would say that if there's something very similar to my earlier statement about pulling inspiration from certain things, don't be afraid to use something else as an outline for it. It's not necessarily a copy and paste aspect, but if you like certain, like the bare bones of a particular character's background and you want that to translate into your own, don't be afraid to use that as, the skeleton of it.
Yeah.
Well.
And also speaking with the DM,
Yeah, definitely.
It's always kind of hit or miss. I know there are some DMs who like to go by the book and their rules as written. I've been lucky to not have that necessarily. So yeah, communicate with your DM, Jack. Talk to your DM, and they will help you. Characters or players in games have a interesting challenge that is a little different than DMs have. Like DMs are telling a story, and they have to communicate and tell it with the players. Players have this weird challenge of having to give and take the spotlight and share this kind of the time to all be the heroes. And I think the best way to get an idea of those is by looking at streams, like all the ones that you're on. You guys put a lot of effort into making sure your stories are told well, and you put a lot of a lot of give and take, kind of creating an ensemble. Do you have any tricks that you guys use in those, or just in your home games, that help you keep a good back and forth teamwork kind of situation going?
Well, I would say, and it's something I practice kind of across the board as a player, as a DM, really just in any type of cooperative game at any point in time, is the approach of yes and. So I don't know if you've heard that, like in improv specifically.
I have, but let's just go over it again, just because.
Definitely. So, okay, it's been a while since I've had an improv class, but the way I look at it is that if you're approached with a situation, I come forward to another player, or another player character, I should say, and say, I'm really upset about this. I want to take this course of action. And this person can very easily end our interaction and say no. And then that no is very difficult to kind of move forward from at that point. You've hit the end of the sentence. It's not a comma. You're not giving the person the opportunity of, okay, I see what you're saying there. And let's also discuss this option, or let's discuss this option. It's about compromising, kind of that ebb and flow between players, if you will.
Interesting. That is like the yes and is kind of a basic concept that we throw around a lot, but I liked your description of it. It is all about not ending the moment suddenly. I just remember, it brings me back to my one and only improv class I took in college, and we had one guy who he'd be the no person, and we'd always have to figure out how to work around it. That's just a side tangent story. It'd always be that one guy. So that's really interesting thinking about that. I was going to follow up on that one, but you answered that. So let's move on to your content. Like I said, I noticed you had been doing quite a bit of content. Your latest project has been the Art and Arcana series. Tell me a little bit more about that and what you're accomplishing with that series.
So what I wanted to do is, because Art and Arcana is an amazing book. I love going through it. There's so much history, and just aside from the history, just an insane amount of art in that book, pulling from the earliest days of Dungeons and Dragons to all the most recent stuff with 5th edition and the new influences that have taken place. And I wanted to say, okay, well, I have this amazing source of art that I could be showing off. but I want to give a real surface level idea, because that would take way too long to try to photograph every single page of it. That's a lot of
Yeah.
content. So I'm going through right now. I kind of started out with a very intentional 3-image spread across my Instagram page to kind of say, like, here, this is the cover of Art and Arcana. This is the building block and the foundation of what we're going, like, moving up in my feed at that point. So going from each chapter, there's 9 chapters total, leading from like the very beginning base of Dungeons and Dragons, some of the history and large moments throughout leading up to 5th edition as well. I'm also kind of sprinkling in what they refer to as the evolutions.
Mm-hmm.
A really cool play on evolutions. So we'll play there. Of different iconic monsters, like the Beholder's a part of it, dragons as well. Then you have the Many Faces, which cover individuals like Lolth, Acererak, Strahd as well.
Mm-hmm.
So there's I'm just trying to find what I feel are like really important figures and monsters within that book, and just trying to outline it for everyone.
Okay. had noticed, I think it was before you got into the Art and Arcana, you did a thing on Drizzt. Was that before or during the Art and Arcana?
During. It's one of my faces.
Okay.
Yeah.
He's one of the characters that always caught my attention because of the books, and I think a lot of people have been there. What of these like stories and these bits that you're pulling from it, what about them catches your attention?
And at first, this is going to sound really shallow, but it's the aesthetic right off the bat.
Okay.
And a lot of my content is reduced down to the aesthetic value, but more than that, I'm wanting it to be just an image that can come across someone's feed and say, okay, wait a second, I want to go back to that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm seeing something interesting in this that I could have easily overlooked had it not been shown in a certain way. Try to highlight certain aspects of it with a lot of the evolutions and Many Faces. They're actually in the book across 2 pages.
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult to get all the detail in one picture for that, and it's very distracting. It's just not a really good image overall, at least not on the social media platform.
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult to capture that accurately. So I have them spread across 2 images, just uploaded separately. So people are getting to see the detail from the very first bit of artwork, like for the Beholder, and coming up to all the recent like 5th edition versions of Beholder, along with even like miniatures that I'm lucky enough to have. I don't have a ton of minis. I really want to get better at that, but I'm trying to feature all the different pieces of art really that are available within the community.
Okay. Interesting, because I picked up Art and Arcana a long time ago, and then I'd given it to my niece because she's an artist. But I do remember it had like the most amazing stuff, and for me it was like there's too much, and so I'd look through, and then I'd be like, I don't know what to look at anymore. But you figured out a way to just like pick out the ones that are interesting. So instead of having to re-buy the book, I just look at your Instagram, and we're good. Shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk about your history running games and see if I can get some advice from you from your experience. When did you start running games, and why did you just start DMing?
Understood. So technically, I began running my first campaign a little over 2 years ago. As I mentioned to you earlier, I had a really big hiatus with DMing, probably for a solid year, because I was involved in a lot as a player in a lot of games. And we just transitioned to, my partner actually started running Princes of the Apocalypse, and we just kind of transitioned that group over into that, which was fun because I love playing just as much as I love DMing. But I started with the Lost Mines of Phandelver. It's a really good first one to start with as a DM, and had introduced a couple friends. Actually, it was one of their first experiences with tabletop gaming, which was really cool. So we ran that for a bit, started going into more homebrew stuff, took a hiatus from that, and just before everything with the COVID outbreak currently going on, I had started running Descent into Avernus, and then all this started, so now that one's on too.
Interesting. So you've done a lot of modules then, it sounds like, as well as some homebrew, you said.
A little bit, yes.
what percentage would you say you're at in terms of like how much modules versus how much homebrew?
I'd say 75 module, 25 homebrew.
Okay. And so which is your favorite that you've got to experience of the modules?
My favorite module? That's difficult. Have a group that's currently going through Curse of Strahd, and I'm really enjoying that one. Unfortunately, that one's also on pause right now, but as a player, I've really enjoyed that. I haven't gotten very far into Descent into Avernus, but as a dungeon master, I'm also enjoying that one as
Mhm.
well.
Okay. Um, so I had to look because bonus action Tim DeRoos is in the chat and he had a question, but we're gonna get to that one a little later because this question I wanted to ask you. Since you ran Lost Mine and you've done some module stuff, there's a difficulty in tying player backstory into pre-written modules sometimes that I've run into myself. And I know a lot of other newer DMs run into that. How were you able to drag your players into a module, adding in their backstory? What do you look for to hook a player in?
Well, so with my group specifically, I would say we got very lucky in the fact that it is an incredibly creative bunch of people. Um, Almost all of them have a theater background, which I personally don't really have much of. So they came in with I really want this aspect of my backstory. And it was very convenient because it
Mm-hmm.
was easy to actually tie a lot of them together. And that was incredibly unintentional on their parts. I thought some of them had talked with each other, but nope, they hadn't. We just got very lucky. Although I did have one of my players was kind of like me, very hesitant to really do much of backstory wise. So it took a little bit longer to flesh out. But what was really nice about it is she started picking up bits from the module that when we were in Lost Mine module, bits and pieces, and she's like, "Oh, I want to incorporate these together." And it's like, "Okay, that's perfect." So there was a bit of just having that open communication with the new player, and as still technically a new DM at the time,
Mm-hmm.
communication was incredibly important.
Yeah, that actually sounds like very lucky. Like
Yes, I got.
having from my experience of running Lost Mine, I've attempted it several times, never get very far because the players always go off the rails. But I've also found with a lot of my experience with new players is we don't really want to do backstories because we don't know what we're going up against. We don't know how to tell a backstory, and then that makes it a little more difficult trying to walk them through creating a character backstory, this kind of thing. So that sounds like you've been very blessed in that regard. Um,
Definitely.
so tying on to that, where I'm actually going to ask you Tim's question
Okay.
because it involves tying in characters' backstories. He's saying, um, and I'm not sure what he's referring to. I believe this is probably the River Break stream, but he said, I
Okay.
loved how your DM implemented a backstory later in the campaign. Does that sound about right? River Break,
Later
maybe
in the
Fabled. Um, but his real question was any time on other ways to do that for my first time players after 2 years in a campaign. So have you had
Ooh,
any? You understand that question?
no, I'll need you to
Okay.
repeat that.
Do you have any advice on ways to implement a character's backstory later in a campaign when you've been running it for a while?
Understood. Um, I would say that maybe a staggered approach would be helpful. So if you're anticipating implementing it later on, um, have a couple moments leading up to it where it's like, here's a breadcrumb. And then maybe next session, here's another little breadcrumb. Hints to the player specifically, as well as the group as a whole to see if they start picking up on it. Just so not all of a sudden it's, hey, guess whose backstory we're going into now, and really blunt about it because that can cause some disconnect. I feel like it just interrupts the flow
Mm-hmm.
if it gets brought up all at
Yeah,
once.
I agree. That is a good point. Just like little bit at a time, little
Mhm.
drops here. And following up, he's clarifying a little bit in the chat. He's saying when transitioning from a module to a homebrew, I think that is the perfect way to do it. When you're, dropping some breadcrumbs in the module and then those breadcrumbs continue into the homebrew, would make a nice smooth transition. I'm playing in a game. We're going on 4 years. Our DM still drops bombs, like backstory bombs, on us. And so we're still learning more about each other's characters, like every other session. It's crazy. But she took that breadcrumb after breadcrumb kind of approach, which is, that's really good advice. I do not do that myself well enough, I don't think.
And it
Learn
takes
new
time.
things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Takes time. We're all here to, get better and keep learning the craft and making progress on that. That being said, bringing in players is I have to recollect my thoughts, because when you come up with good things to say, then I lose where I'm going because you answer my questions. So now I want to know, and this has been a tough question for some people, is what is your greatest struggle as a game master?
Ooh. I would say it's not necessarily understanding the mechanics or feeling comfortable with my players, but it's an inherent and this is me across the board even as a player too, second guessing myself. Um and I think that's probably a common thing from
Yeah.
discussions I've had with other dungeon masters is like I'm very confident in knowing what's going on in combat. I'm confident knowing that I can role play well with my players or the other characters at the table. But every now and again, that nagging sense of doubt can become something much larger if I don't address it very quickly. So it's not necessarily like one aspect of the game, but just a personal insecurity, if you will.
Yeah. And I think that's definitely something a lot of people would struggle with. I know I do. And especially new player or new dungeon masters would have that. So what do you do to kind of nip that in the bud when you start feeling that way?
I have open communication with my partner very, very frequently. If I'm having insecurities in that way as a player in games, on streams, even if I feel like, man, that really just wasn't my best stream tonight, um, I'll kind of talk with him about it. And I'm very lucky in the fact that we both are so immersed in Dungeons and
Mm-hmm.
Dragons together that, he can understand where I'm coming from as a dungeon master and as a player. That being said, I've also reached out to my dungeon masters as a player, or even to like specific players that are friends outside of the group,
Mm-hmm.
saying, "Hey, I'm just feeling kind of weird about this. What's your thought? Can you give me feedback on this?" And most of the time, that dialogue is either one reassuring or two, like maybe sometimes confirming that, "Oh man, yeah, they saw that I was being kind of weird about something." And they noticed it and they cared about it. And that's the big part for me is knowing that there's a relationship at the table that is very much a two-way street. We have a mutual respect as players and as dungeon masters.
That's a really good way to do it. That ties into the theme that's been showing up on the show all week is communication with the players, with dungeon masters, and you just hit that nail on the head, I think, as in that regard. But to make it a little more complicated,
Oh boy.
when you're standing there or sitting there running your game, you're the game master,
Mhm.
and you start feeling those doubts. How do you get past that and just to finish the game?
Fake it till you make it. Uh, that's the only way I can put it. It's going to be that way across the board for me. I may
Mm-hmm.
be feeling a bit weird about something, but I'm going to try my best to make sure they don't notice. Sometimes they still do because we know each other as people. So, but it's just that little push at least till the end of the session.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Just fake it. Um, that's really good. Thank you for sharing that. I know insecurities with game masters is not something that we talk about a lot in general in content creation space, in anything, and focusing on something that's pretty vulnerable. So I appreciate you bringing that up. A lot of people say, "Oh, my combat's not very good," or "I'm not good at math." I'm not good at math, but admitting that you doubt yourself sometimes is admirable. So thank you. Um, Now, switching gears from that, I send out an email all the time and I say, I'm going to ask you a specific question. So this is that. I want to know your number one tip for new game masters who are just getting started in the hobby.
Understood. So I'm really hoping I'm not duplicating one because I haven't had a chance to go through one. I know there's been a ton of people before me, but I would say that my number one tip I could give new game masters would be to let your players solve the problems. I know that seems like a fairly well, of course, duh, that's the point of D&D. Your players are going to solve problems that you're giving them, but I think it's a worthwhile conversation to be had. And I actually pulled that tip early on as a DM when I was watching some of Matt Colville's Running the Game series.
Mm-hmm.
There was one video in particular. It was about like keeping sessions on the rails versus railroading, and he made a statement regarding what he saw the role of the dungeon master to be, saying something to the effect of it's the dungeon master's job to, or sorry, it's not the dungeon master's job to solve the player's problems. It's their job to solve their solutions.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I feel like that's something that I really benefited from as a dungeon master when I started going into preparations for my sessions and thinking, okay, I'm going to present them with this problem, and this is how I hope they'll get to the solution, but that's not the only way that they can get to it. So having that open option in game for them to present an alternative that I didn't expect, I think has led to a lot of really great scenarios in game for me.
That is, no one's ever said that one before.
Oh
So
my god.
that is a really good one. And that was one I do remember that from his video because I learned how to DM from him a lot. And yeah, that's a very good tip. Now, here's the hard part of that is when you're coming up with a challenge and what if you make it a little too difficult? How do you keep a game flowing when you may have over-challenged your players?
Um, oh, that's a really good question. Um, because it's definitely happened once or twice for me, and that's the dangers of prepping occasionally, which I'm guilty of doing. But um, I would say just completely letting go of the expectation of what you thought the solution was going to be. If your group is coming up with something that they're pretty set on saying, I really think this is going to be our best course of action. If it's not what you had planned, that's not the end of their world.
Mm-hmm.
If it's valid enough for them to get to what you wanted the outcome to be, then that's something that you should let your players try out at the very least. So that's why I try to personally now I avoid puzzles that have, like, for instance, specific numeric outcomes that I want, because if that what they're coming up with hasn't been referenced earlier on and won't serve a purpose later on, what's the point of it?
Yeah.
Something more abstract for them, open-ended, that they can come up with.
That's a really good point. And that ties back into what you were saying earlier about the yes-anding, and being able to do that as a game master in these scenarios is really tough. Jack Grimble said, lie about your dice rolls. There's mixed feelings on that sometimes.
There's debates. Yes, I definitely understand. And I mean, I will be perfectly honest, with my very first group of first-time players, I am guilty of having fudged a dice roll behind my screen. It's either that or characters were going to be dying. So I didn't want to turn them off from the game completely.
Yeah, I think we've all kind of been there early on. Like, you want to protect the new players a little bit. And then later you get a little more hardened. And you're like, no, a nat 20 is a nat 20. If the wizard dies, they die. That's how I've seen it.
Oh, man. My first wizard character. Yeah, I feel that.
You feel it a little bit. Since you started, and since it's a very recent thing, since you started running games, how has your game mastering style changed over the years?
Ooh, okay. So I think the big thing that's changed the most for me has been how I prepare for sessions. I used to be incredibly diligent about wanting to have every single thing mapped out, and realizing I'm spending way too much time on this and I'm not giving them enough, like, I'm not letting them come up with the solutions at that point. So now I'm a bit more relaxed in terms of how I prep. I still like to be, aware of where I'm going with my characters and knowing how I'm going to describe scenarios for them. So if they go off in a direction I wasn't expecting, I still have something to fall back on. Um, but in game, I think I've become a lot more descriptive.
Okay.
Yes.
So that actually gave me two other questions I want to follow up. So it might seem a little disjointed right now. So going back to your preparation, how do you decide what you're going to prepare for a campaign session?
Ooh, okay. So I will say it's easier running modules because I pretty much have everything I need right there in that book for me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I try to follow where I'm thinking that my group is going. Thankfully, because it's been the same group for a while, for the most part, I can kind of predict where they're planning on heading next. Every now and again,
Mm-hmm.
they surprise me, I will say, or they approach something I did not expect them to go in that direction. So I have to maybe say, hey, let's just take a quick break, go get drinks. I'm just going to read something really fast. Point. So I've definitely had to BS my way through a couple things, but I try to do like a really rough outline, just read ahead a little bit so I know the basic layout if they're going into a certain building. And this may sound kind of weird, but I like to actually visualize myself as a character going through that location. So it's almost like as I'm describing it, I'm describing the house that I'm in right
Mm-hmm.
now. I know the hallway, I know which door to take to get to my closet. So just as natural as a building I've gone to before, now I can introduce them to that location.
That's a really good way to look at those. And that actually answered kind of my other question was how do you become more descriptive um, in your running your games? But then there was a very good question from the chat that I want to touch on. They were asking, stepping up as a DM for a bunch of theater people, and you
Mm-hmm.
said you're not really a theater people. How has that changed how you play the game?
Oh, goodness. They are inspiring in the best possible way, and they're challenging in the best possible way because they bring an energy to the table that I feel like I have to match. And it's an invigorating experience, honestly. It's definitely intimidating at times because they're amazing actors and they're giving me a lot to work with. So I'm just gonna say it's an amazing group of people. I've been very fortunate.
And that is, I've had a similar experience. One of my groups is a bunch of theater stage combat people, so they push me to make my combat interesting, which is kind of tough. And then they're also like, super theatrical, so I have to. You do kind of feel the way to. You have to get to their level, or else you feel like they're bored. Have you ever felt that way?
I started to, yeah,
Okay.
feeling like, oh no, I'm afraid this person's gonna start zoning out because I am not matching their intensity right now. One of
Mm-hmm.
our players in particular, he's 120%.
Okay.
And it can be absolutely absurd in one direction, or it can just be like the most heart-wrenching experience that he's delivering. It's amazing. I love it because I feel like I can step back every now and again from my table, and I actually wanted to bring this up earlier. I can step back and just watch them for a solid amount of time because I don't really need to direct their RP at any point in time. They, for the most part, feed off each other, and it's just really fun to watch.
So when you step back, how do you know when to take the reins again?
Um, Either when the same topic is being discussed more than twice, usually. So if they're kind of going in a circle and not really knowing when to get off the roundabout, then I'm like, okay, let's try to transition in. Or if someone's starting to kind of fall back and become almost a wallflower,
Mm-hmm.
I'll try to jump in and be like, okay, tell me what this individual is doing right now. What's going on? All this interactions occurring.
Mm-hmm.
So we're getting everyone the opportunity to kind of step in and have their say for the scenario.
That's interesting. You point out the wallflower person because you're not the first one to mention that idea. But this week is the first time that I've heard that concept come up. It was you and Malcolm from Gentleman Game Master had said the same thing. When there's a wallflower, you ask the wallflower, and a lot of times they're ready to move on. Is that kind of the gist of it for you?
Times, yeah.
That's interesting, and I like that idea. I'm going to have to try that next time I'm playing because that is a really great. If multiple people are saying it, it's got to have something to it. Very cool. That's why when you were saying that, I was like, okay, nice. There is another question tying into your descriptive techniques. So it actually has several parts. So the first is, what do you focus on when describing the world to your players?
Their immediate senses, where they're located. So I obviously think about, okay, if they're outdoors, what time of day is it? What are they seeing around them? What are they feeling around them? What do they smell? What do they hear? Trying to give them just kind of an overall picture of, if they were standing out there right now, what's their experience. If we're talking on a more descriptive, like overall, like, oh, here, I'm going to describe this city to you, it's not quite as detailed, but taking aspects of each of those, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so you'll kind of paint with a broad strokes when you're doing a city, but then you'll focus on the exact location they're at a little more.
Yeah, their
Right?
campsite, the descriptions of their campsite are more important to me than the descriptions of their neighborhood. So,
Yeah, okay. So then the follow-up question that they asked is, what is the best thing to pay attention to have the players get the best feel for the surroundings?
ooh, okay. I try to, and it's difficult when you're sitting at the table sometimes because people are spread out. But I try to scan everyone's faces as best I can when I'm going through my descriptive process. Some people might react better to, like, oh, okay, she mentioned an interesting sound that happened, or, oh, I'm smelling cinnamon. Why am I smelling cinnamon right now? So, like, who perks up at what kind of gives me an idea of what I could potentially address better in the future.
That's a really good idea. Um, but here's the challenge
Mm-hmm.
that I come up with there, and I do like that idea, and I'm like, I should look into that more. When running modules, though, a lot of times they have the read aloud text. Um,
Mm-hmm.
how do you get your face out of the book and looking at the players from those situations, or do you just remember what the gist of the text is?
I try to remember the gist of the text. That's kind of part of the prep process
Mm-hmm.
for me. So at least if I'm remembering that they're specifically mentioning, a window that's open that I know is relevant in some way, or a passerby that's mentioned in that read aloud text. Um, I'll be sure to include like what seems like the primary bits of information, and maybe I'll deviate a bit from their description a little bit just so I can still be descriptive but maintain focus on the group.
That's a really good tip. That's a good one. I don't know what you did, but you got a lot of questions coming in today. I haven't seen this many questions from the viewers in a while. Um, that was that one. So now that's where we're at in the show, is just getting questions. What are your personal pet peeves while playing or DMing a game? This is not exactly, what is it called? Philosophy and technique of DMing, but just, get to know you a little more kind of question. What are your pet peeves?
My personal pet peeves are oh goodness, that's difficult. I'm kind of difficult to irritate, to be honest, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't like when people are not flexible in character. I understand wanting to maintain this is what my character would do, but we also have to find motivation for why our characters are in a group. And if we're all a bunch of people who are so set in our ways that we're not communicating with one another, why is my character with you right now? So it just has to be some flexibility while still maintaining the integrity of your character.
Yeah. And that's actually just a straight up good tip for players too, is remember you're part of a team.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not just your story, which goes back to the yes-anding everything. It all comes back around.
Mm-hmm.
I'll throw my 2 cents in of pet peeves. I don't like it when after a year and a half, a player has not learned the basics of their most basic things. I
That's
know it's purely mechanical based, but if you've been playing a wizard for like 2 years and you don't know how magic missile works, read the book. That's how I look at it. But I know that's me, and I and my players that I have, I can tell them things like that. Can't always do that with everybody.
that's fair. And it really depends on the table.
Yeah.
I really love spellcasters specifically, so I try not to be a stickler or a rules lawyer when it comes to that kind of stuff. I'm
Mm-hmm.
happy to explain it to my players, but if you're wanting to jump in as a wizard as your first character, I did that and it's an undertaking. So,
Yeah.
like, a lot to learn.
Yeah. Doing spellcasters early on is tough. Um, all right. Now, last question. Where can everyone find you online, and what can they expect to see from your content?
Awesome. So you can find me on both Instagram and Twitter. I'm primarily on Instagram, though, to be honest. My handle's at Breanna Flaim. It's my name, so it's easy to remember for me. And you should be expecting a lot of tabletop photos, pretty dice, pretty books, pretty much anything aesthetically pleasing that I can find within the community. So that'd be obviously Wizards of the Coast published content, or handmade dice bags. I want to feature all creatives in the community on my page.
Mhm. And I will vouch, it's some absurdly good looking pictures you come out with where it's like, well, can't compete with that sometimes. Um, and so that link is going to be in the description of this video. So make sure you guys go ahead and check out her Instagram page. And lately, the Art and Arcana stuff, I've been really getting into the quotes you've been posting in there and reading a little more about the history of the characters and the design. It's been fun. So thank you, Breanna, for coming on the show and having this chat with me. It was really good getting a little bit of the insight from your experiences as a player and a DM. So thank you. That's all. Just thank you for coming on.
Okay,
Um,
thanks.
if you guys haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. And go follow Breanna on Instagram. Again, like I said, links in the description. Tomorrow, I did not end up getting a guest, so I'm just going to be doing a stream tomorrow by myself, preparing for my game session on Monday. So if you guys are all around, come back and join me then. All in all, thanks for watching, everybody.
Mhm.